Around the World in 80 Days, by Jules Verne, Chapter 1, in which Phileas Fogg and Passepartout accept each other, one as master, the other as man. Mr. Phileas Fogg lived in 1872 at No. 7 Savile Row, Burlington Gardens, the house in which Sheraton died in 1814. He was one of the most noticeable members of the Reform Club, though he seemed always to avoid attracting attention, an enigmatical personage about whom little was known, except that he was a polished man of the world. People said that he resembled Byron, at least, that is, his head was Byronic, but he was a bearded, tranquil Byron who might live on 1,000 years without growing old. Certainly an Englishman, it was more doubtful whether Phileas Fogg was a Londoner. He was never seen on 'Change, nor at the bank, nor in the counting rooms of the city. No ships ever came into London docks of which he was the owner. He had no public employment. He had never been entered in any of the Inns of Court, either at the Temple or Lincoln's Inn or Gray's Inn, nor had his voice ever resounded in the Court of Chancery, or in the Exchequer, or in the Queen's Bench, or the ecclesiastical courts. He certainly wasn't a manufacturer, nor was he a merchant or a gentleman farmer. His name was strange to the scientific and learned societies, and he never was known to take part in the sage deliberations of the Royal Institution, or the London Institution, the Artisans' Association, or the Institution of Arts and Sciences. He belonged, in fact, to none of the numerous societies which swarmed the English capital, from the Harmonic to that of the entomologists, founded mainly for the purpose of abolishing pernicious insects. Phileas Fogg was a member of the Reform, and that was all. The way in which he got admission to the exclusive club was simple enough. He was recommended by the Barings, with whom he had an open credit. His checks were regularly paid at sight from his account current, which was always flush. Was Phileas Fogg rich? Undoubtedly. But those who knew him best could not imagine how he made his fortune, and Mr. Fogg was the last person whom to apply for the information. He was not lavish, nor, on the contrary, avaricious. For whenever he knew that money was needed for a noble, useful, or benevolent purpose, he supplied it quietly and sometimes anonymously. He was, in short, the least communicative of men. He talked very little, and it seemed all the more mysterious for his taciturn manner. His daily habits were quite open to the observation. But whatever he did was so exactly the same thing that he had always done before that the wits of those curious were fairly puzzled. Had he travelled? It was likely, for no one seemed to know the world more familiarly. There was no spot so secluded that he did not have appeared to have an intimate acquaintance with it. He often corrected, with a few clear words, the 1,000 conjectures advanced by members of the club as to the lost and unheard-of travellers, pointing out the true probabilities, and seeming as if gifted with a sort of second sight. So often did events justify his predictions, he must have travelled everywhere, at least in the spirit. It was at least certain that Phileas Fogg had not absented himself from London for many years. Those who were honoured by a better acquaintance with him than the rest declared that nobody could pretend to have ever seen him anywhere else. His sole pastimes were reading the papers and playing whist. He often won at this game, which, as a silent one, harmonized with his nature. But his winnings never went into his purse. Being reserved as a fund for his charities, Mr. Fogg played not to win, but for the sake of playing. The game was in his eyes a contest, a struggle with difficulty, yet a motionless, unwearying struggle congenial to his tastes. Phileas Fogg was not known to have either wife or children, which may happen to the most honest people, either relatives or near friends, which is certainly more unusual. He lived alone in his house at Savile Row, with an unpenetrated. A single domestic sufficed to serve him. He breakfasts and dined at the club, at hours mathematically fixed, in the same room, at the same table, never taking his meals with other members, much less bringing a guest with him, and went home exactly at midnight, only to retire at once to bed. He never used the cosy chambers which the Reform provides for its favoured members. He passed 10 hours out of the 24 in Savile Row, either in sleeping or making his toilet. When he chose to take a walk, it was with a regular step in the entrance hall with its mosaic flooring, or in the circular gallery with its dome supported by 20 red porphyry Ionic columns, and illuminated by blue-painted windows. When he breakfasted or dined, all the resources of the club, its kitchens and pantries, its buttery and dairy, aided to crowd his table with their most succulent stores. He was served by the gravest waiters, in dress coats and shoes with swanskin soles, who proffered the viands in special porcelain, and on the finest linen, club decanters of a lost mould contained his sherry, his port, and his cinnamon-spiced claret, while his beverages were refreshingly cooled with ice, brought at great cost from the American lakes. If to live in this style is to be eccentric, it must be confessed that there is something good in eccentricity. The mansion in Savile Row, though not sumptuous, was exceedingly comfortable. The habits of its occupants were such as to demand but little from the sole domestic. But Phileas Fogg required him to be almost superhumanly prompt and regular. On this very 2nd of October, he had dismissed James Forster because that luckless youth had brought him shaving water at 84 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 86, and he was awaiting his successor, who was due at the house between 11 and half past. Phileas Fogg was seated squarely in his armchair, his feet close together like those of a grenadier on a parade, his hands resting on his knee, his body straight, his head erect. He was steadily watching a complicated clock which indicated the hours, the minutes, the seconds, the days, the months, and the years. At exactly 11:30, Mr. Fogg would, according to his daily habit, quit Savile Row and repair to the Reform. A rap at this moment sounded on the door of the cosy apartment where Phileas Fogg was seated, and James Forster, the dismissed servant, appeared. "The next servant," said he. A young man of 30 advanced and bowed. "You are a Frenchman, I believe?" asked Phileas Fogg. "And your name is John?" "Jean, if monsieur pleases," replied the newcomer. "Jean Passepartout, a surname which has clung to me because I have a natural aptness for going out of one business into another. I believe I'm honest, monsieur, but to be outspoken, I've had several trades. I've been an itinerant singer, a circus rider, and I used to vault like Leotardo and dance on the rope like Blondine. Then I got to be professor of gymnastics, so to make better use of my talents, I was a sergeant fireman at Paris, and assisted many a big fire. But I quitted France 5 years ago, and wishing to taste the sweets of domestic life, took service here as a valet in England. Finding myself out of place, and hearing that Monsieur Phileas Fogg was the most exact and settled gentleman in the United Kingdom, I have come to Monsieur in the hope of living with him a tranquil life, and forgetting even the name of Passepartout." "Passepartout suits me," responded Mr. Fogg. "You are well recommended to me. I hear a good report of you. You know my conditions?" "Yes, monsieur." "Good. What time is it?" 22 minutes after 11, returned Passepartout, drawing an enormous silver watch from the depths of his pocket. "You are too slow," said Mr. Fogg. Pardon me, monsieur. It's impossible. You are 4 minutes too slow. No matter. It's enough to mention the hour. Now, from this moment, 29 minutes after 11 a.m., this Wednesday, 2nd October, you are in my service." Phileas Fogg got up, took his hat in his left hand, put it on his head with an automatic motion, and went off without a word. Passepartout heard the street door shut once. It was his new master going out. He heard it shut again. It was his predecessor, James Forster, departing, and in his turn, Passepartout remained alone in the house in Savile Row. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2, in which Passepartout is convinced that he has at last found his ideal. "Faith," muttered Passepartout, somewhat flurried, "I've seen people at Madame Toussaint's as lively as my new master." Madame Toussaint's people, let it be said, are of wax, and are much visited in London. Speech is all that is wanting to make them human. During his brief interview with Mr. Fogg, Passepartout had been carefully observing him. He appeared to be a man about 40 years of age, with fine, handsome features, and a tall, well-shaped figure. His hair and whiskers were light, his forehead compact and unwrinkled, his face rather pale, his teeth magnificent. His countenance possessed in the highest degree what physiognomists call a repose in action, a quality of those who act rather than talk. Calm and phlegmatic, with a clear eye, Mr. Fogg seemed a perfect type of that English composure which Angelica Kauffmann had so skillfully represented on canvas. Seen in the various phases of his daily life, he gave the idea of being perfectly well-balanced, as exactly regulated as a Leroy chronometer. Phileas Fogg was indeed exactitude personified, and this was betrayed even in the expression of his very hands and feet, for in men as well in animals, the limbs themselves are expressions of their passions. He was so exact that he was never in a hurry, was always ready, and was economical alike in the steps and his motions. He never took one step too many, and always went to his destination by the shortest cut. He made no superfluous gestures, and was never seen to be moved or agitated. He was the most deliberate person in the world, yet always reached his destination at the exact moment. He lived alone and, so to speak, outside of every social relation, and as he knew that his world account must be taken into a friction, and that a friction retards, he never rubbed against anybody. As for Passepartout, he was a true Parisian of Paris. Since he had abandoned his own country for England, taking service as a valet, he had in vain searched for a master after his own heart. Passepartout was by no means one of those pert dunces despised by Molière, with a bold gaze and a nose held high in the air. He was an honest fellow, with a pleasant face, lips a trifle protruding, soft-mannered and serviceable, with a good round head, such as one likes to see on the shoulders of a friend. His eyes were blue, his complexion rubicund, and his figure most portly and well built. his body muscular and his physical powers fully developed by the exercises of his younger days. His brown hair was somewhat tumbled, for while the ancient sculptors are said to have known 18 methods of arranging Minerva's tresses, Passepartout is familiar with but one of dressing his own. 3 strokes of a large toothed plume completed his toilet. It would be rash to predict how Passepartout's lively nature would agree with Mr. Fogg. It was impossible to tell whether the new servant would turn out as absolutely methodical as his master required. Experience alone could solve the question. Passepartout had been a sort of vagrant in his early years, and now yearned for repose. But so far he had failed to find it, though he had already served in 10 English houses. But he could not take root in any of these. With chagrin he found his masters invariably whimsical and irregular, constantly running about the country or on the lookout for adventure. His last master, young Lord Longferry, Member of Parliament after passing his nights in the Haymarket taverns, was too often brought home in the morning on policemen's shoulders. Passepartout, desirous of a respecting gentleman whom he deserved, ventured a mild remonstrance on such conduct, which being ill received, he took leave, hearing that Mr. Phileas Fogg was looking for a servant, and that his life was one of unbroken regularity, that he neither travelled nor stayed from home overnight. He felt sure that this would be the place he was after. He presented himself and was accepted, as he had been seen. At 11:30, then, Passepartout found himself alone in the house at Savile Row. He began his inspection without delay, scouring it from cellar to garret. So clean, well-arranged, solemn a mansion pleased him. It seemed to him like a snail shell lighted and warmed by gas, which sufficed for both those purposes. When Passepartout reached the 2nd story, he recognized at once the room which he was to inhabit, and he was well satisfied with it. Electric bells and speaking tubes afforded communication with the lower stories, while on the mantel stood an electric clock, precisely like that in Mr. Fogg's bedchamber, both beating the same second at the same instant. "That's good, that'll do," said Passepartout to himself. He suddenly observed, hung over the clock, a card which, upon inspection, proved to be a program of the daily routine of the house. It comprised all that was required of the servant, from 8 in the morning, exactly at which hour Phileas Fogg rose, till 11:30, when he left the house for the Reform Club. All the details of service, the tea and toast at 23 minutes past 8, the shaving water at 37 minutes past 9, and the toilet at 20 minutes before 10. Everything was regulated and foreseen that was to be done from 11:30 a.m. till midnight, the hour at which the methodical gentleman retired. Mr. Fogg's wardrobe was amply supplied and in the best taste. Each pair of trousers, coat, and vest bore a number, indicating the time of year and season at which they were in turn to be laid out for wearing. And the same system was applied to the master's shoes. In short, the house in Savile Row, which must have been a very temple of disorder and unrest under the illustrious but dissipated Sheridan, was coziness, comfort, and method idealized. There was no studying, nor were there books, which would have been quite useless to Mr. Fogg, for the reformed 2 libraries, one of the general literature and the other of law and politics, were at his service. A moderate-sized safe stood in his bedroom, constructed so as to defy fire as well as burglars, but Passepartout found neither arms nor hunting weapons anywhere. Everything betrayed the most tranquil and peaceable habits. Having scrutinized the house from top to bottom, he rubbed his hands, a broad smile overspread his features, and he said joyfully, "This is just what I wanted. We shall get on together, Mr. Fogg and I. What a domestic and regular gentleman. A real machine. Well, I don't mind serving a machine." End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, in which a conversation takes place which seems likely to cost Phileas Fogg dear. Phileas Fogg, having shut the door of his house at 11:30, and having put his right foot before his left 575 times, and his left foot before his right 576 times, reached the Reform Club, an imposing edifice in Pall Mall, which could not have cost less than 3 millions. He repaired at once to the dining room, the 9 windows of which open upon a tasteful garden, where the trees were already gilded with autumn colouring, and took his place at the habitual table, the cover of which had already been laid for him. His breakfast consisted of a side dish, a broiled fish with Reading sauce, a scarlet slice of roast beef garnished with mushrooms, a rhubarb and gooseberry tart, and a morsel of Cheshire cheese, the whole being washed down with several cups of tea, for which the Reform is famous. He rose at 13 minutes to 1, and directed his steps towards the large hall, a sumptuous apartment adorned with lavishly framed paintings. A flunkey handed him an uncut Times, which he proceeded to cut with a skill which betrayed familiarity with his delicate operation. The perusal of this paper absorbed Phileas Fogg until about 4:15, whilst the Standard, his next task, occupied him till the dinner hour. Dinner passed as breakfast had done, and Mr. Fogg reappeared in the reading room and sat down to the Pall Mall at 20 minutes before 6. Half an hour later, several members of the Reform came in and drew up into the fireplace, where a coal fire was steadily burning. They were Mr. Fogg's usual partners at whist, and there were Stewart, an engineer, John Sullivan and Samuel Fellentin, bankers, Thomas Flanagan, a brewer, and Gauthier Ralph, one of the directors of the Bank of England, all rich and highly respectable personages, even in a club which compromises the princes of English trade and finance. "Well, Ralph," says Thomas Flanagan, "what about that robbery?" "Ooh," replied Stewart, "the bank will lose money." "On the contrary," broke in Ralph, "I hope we may put our hands on that robber. Skillful detectives have been sent to all the principal ports of America and the continent, and he'll be a clever fellow if he slips through their fingers." "But you haven't got the robber's description," asked Stewart. "In the first place, he's no robber at all," returned Ralph positively. "What? A fellow makes off with £55,000 and a robber?" "No." "Perhaps the manufacturer, then?" "The Daily Telegraph says that he's a gentleman." It was Phileas Fogg, whose head now emerged from behind his newspapers, who made this remark. He bowed to his friends and entered into the conversation. The affair which formed its subject, which was now town talk, had occurred 3 days before at the Bank of England. A package of banknotes to the value of £55,000 had been taken from the principal cashier's table, that functionary being at the moment engaged in registering the receipt of 3 shillings and 6pence. Of course, he could not have his eyes everywhere. Let it be observed that the Bank of England reposes a touching confidence in the honesty of the public. There are neither guards nor gratings to protect its treasures. Gold, silver, banknotes are freely exposed and at the mercy of the first comer. A keen observer of English customs relates that, being in one of the rooms of the bank one day, he had the curiosity to examine a gold ingot weighing some 7 or 8 pounds. He took it up, scrutinized it, passed it to his neighbor, he to the next man, and so on until the ingot, going from hand to hand, was transferred to the end of a dark entry, nor did it return to its place for a half hour. Meanwhile, the cashier had not much as raised his head, but in the present instance things had not gone so smoothly. The package of notes had not been found when 5 o'clock sounded from the ponderous clock in the drawing office. The amount was passed to the account of profit and loss, and as soon as the robbery was discovered, picked detectives hastened off to Liverpool, Glasgow, Havre, Suez, Brisbane, New York, and other ports, inspired by the proffered reward of £2,000 and 5% on the sum that might be recovered. Detectives were also charged with narrowly watching those who arrived at or left London by rail, and a judicial examination was once entered upon. There were real grounds for supposing, as the Daily Telegraph said, that the thief did not belong to a professional band. On the day of the robbery, a well-dressed gentleman of polished manners and a well-to-do air had been observed going to and fro in the paying room where the crime was committed. A description of him was easily procured and sent to the detectives, and some hopeful spirits, of whom Ralph was one, did not despair of his apprehension. The papers and clubs were full of the affair, and everywhere the people were discussing the probabilities of a successful pursuit, and the Reform Club was especially agitated, several of its members being bank officials. Ralph would not concede that the work of the detectives was likely to be in vain, for he thought that the prize offered would greatly stimulate their zeal and activity. But Stewart was far from sharing this confidence, and, as they placed themselves at the whist table, they continued to argue the matter. Stewart and Flanagan played together, while Phileas Fogg had Fellentin for his partner. As the game proceeded, the conversation ceased, excepting between the rubbers where it revived again. "I maintain," said Stewart, "that the chances are in favour of the thief, who must be a shrewd fellow." "Well, where can he fly to?" asked Ralph. "No country safe for him." "Pshaw! Where could he go, then?"
"Oh, I don't know that. The world is big enough."
"It was once," said Phileas Fogg in a low tone. "Cop, sir," he added, handing the cards to Thomas Flanagan. The discussion fell during the rubber, after which Stewart's took up its thread.
"What do you mean by once? Has the world grown smaller?"
"Certainly," returned Ralph. "I agree with Mr. Fogg. The world has grown smaller, since a man can now go around it 10 times more quickly than 100 years ago, and that's why the search for this thief will be more likely to succeed. But also why the thief can get away more easily." "Be so good as to play, Mr. Stewart," said Phileas Fogg. But the incredulous Stewart was not convinced, and when the hand was finished said eagerly, "You have a strange way, Ralph, of proving that the world has grown smaller. So because you can go around it in 3 months." "In 80 days, interrupted Phileas Fogg. "That is true, gentlemen," added John Sullivan. "Only 80 days now that the section between Rothal and Allahabad on the Great Indian Peninsula Railway has been opened. Here is the estimate made by the Daily Telegraph. From London to Suez, via Mount Cenis and Brinsday, by rail and steamboats, 7 days from Suez to Bombay by steamer, 13 from Bombay to Calcutta by rail, 3 from Calcutta to Hong Kong by steamer, 13 from Hong Kong to Yokohama by steamer, 6 from Yokohama to San Francisco by steamer, 22 from San Francisco to New York by whale, 7 from New York to London by steamer and rail, 9 total 80 days.
Yes, in 80 days,
exclaimed Stuart, who in excitement made a false deal.
But it doesn't take into account bad weather, contrary winds, shipwrecks, railway accidents, and so on.
All included, returned Phileas Fogg, continuing to play despite the discussion.
But suppose the Hindus or Indians fall off the rails, replied Stuart. Suppose they stop the trains, pillage the luggage van, and scalp the passengers.
All included, calmly retorted Fogg, adding as he threw down the cards, 2 trumps. Stuart, whose turn it was to deal, gathered them up and went on.
You're right, theoretically, Mr. Fogg, but practically
also, Mr. Stuart.
I'd like to see you do it in 80 days.
Depends on you. Shall we go?
Heaven preserve me, but I would wager £4,000 that such a journey made under these conditions is impossible.
Quite possible, on the contrary, returned Mr. Fogg.
Well, make it then.
The journey round the world in 80 days?
Yes.
I should like nothing better.
When?
At once. Only I warn you that I shall do it at your expense.
It's absurd,
cried Stuart, who was beginning to be annoyed at the persistency of his friend.
Come, let's go on with the game.
Deal over again then, said Phileas Fogg. There's a false deal.
Stuart took up the pack with a feverish hand, and then suddenly put them down again.
Well, Mr. Fogg, said he,
it shall be so. I will wager the 4,000 on it.
Calm yourself, dear Stuart, said Fenton. It's only a joke.
Then I'll say I'll wager, returned Stuart. I mean it.
All right, said Mr. Fogg, and turning to the others he continued, I have a deposit of 20,000 at Bowings, which I will willingly risk upon it.
£20,000, cried Sullivan. £20,000, which you would lose by a single accidental delay.
The unforeseen does not exist, quietly replied Phileas Fogg.
But, Mr. Fogg, 80 days are the only estimate of the least possible time in which the journey can be made.
A well-used minimum suffices for everything.
But in order to not exceed it, you must jump mathematically from the trains upon the steamers, and from the steamers upon the trains again.
I will jump mathematically.
You are joking.
A true Englishman doesn't joke when he's talking about so serious a thing as a wager, replied Phileas Fogg solemnly. I will bet £20,000 against anyone who wishes that I will make the tour in the world in 80 days or less, in 1920 hours, or 115,200 minutes. Do you accept?
We accept, replied Messrs. Stuart, Valentin, Sullivan, Flanagan, and Ralph after consulting each other.
Good, said Mr. Fogg. The train leaves for Dover in 9:15. I will take it.
This very evening.
This very evening, returned Phileas Fogg. He took out and consulted a pocket almanac and added, As today is Wednesday, the 2nd of October, I shall be due in London in this very room of the Reform Club on Saturday, the 21st of December. At 9:15 p.m., or else the £20,000, now deposited in my name at Bowings, will belong to you. In fact, and in right, gentlemen, here's a cheque for the amount. A memorandum of the wager was at once drawn up and signed by the 6 parties, during which Phileas Fogg preserved a stoical composure. He certainly did not bet to win, and had only staked the £20,000, half of his fortune, because he foresaw that he might have to spend the other half to carry out this difficult, not to say unattainable, project. As for his antagonists, they seemed much agitated, not so much by the value of their stake, as because they had some scruples about betting under the conditions so difficult to their friend. The clock struck 7, and the party offered to suspend the game so that Mr. Fogg might make his preparations for departure. I am quite ready now, was his tranquil response. Diamonds or trumps? Be so good as to play, gentlemen. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4, in which Phileas Fogg astounds Passepartout, his servant. Having won 20 guineas at whist, and taken leave of his friends, Phileas Fogg, at 7:25, left the Reform Club. Passepartout, who had conscientiously studied the program of his duties, was more than surprised to see his master guilty of the inexactness of appearing at this unaccustomed hour. For, according to rule, he was not due in Savile Row until precisely midnight. Mr. Fogg repaired to his bedroom and called out, Passepartout. Passepartout did not reply. It could not be he who was called. It was not the right hour. Passepartout, repeated Mr. Fogg without raising his voice. Passepartout made his appearance.
"I've called you twice," observed his master. "But it is not midnight," replied the other, showing his watch. "I know it. I don't blame you. We start for Dover and Calais in 10 minutes. A puzzled grin overspread Passepartout's round face. Clearly he had not comprehended his master. "Monsieur is going to leave home?" "Yes," returned Phileas Fogg. "We are going round the world." Passepartout opened wide his eyes, raised his eyebrows, held up his hands, and seemed about to collapse. So overcome was he with the stupefied astonishment. "Round their world," he murmured. "In 80 days, so we haven't a moment to lose." "But the trunks," gasped Passepartout, unconsciously swaying his head from right to left. "We'll have no trunks, only a carpet-bag with 2 shirts and 3 pairs of stockings for me, and the same for you. We'll buy our clothes on the way. Bring down my mackintosh and travelling cloak, and some stout shoes, though we shall do little walking. Make haste!" Passepartout tried to reply, but could not. He went out, mounted to his own room, fell into a chair and muttered, "That's good, that is, and I, who want to remain quiet." He mechanically set about making preparations for departure. Around the world in 80 days. Was his master a fool? No. This was a joke. Then they were going to Dover. Good. To Calais. Good again. After all, Passepartout, who had been away from France 5 years, would not be sorry to set foot on his native soil again. Perhaps they would go as far as Paris, and it would do his eyes good to see Paris once more. But surely a gentleman so chary of his steps would stop there, no doubt. But then it was none the less true that he was going away. This so domestic person hitherto. By 8 o'clock, Passepartout had packed the modest carpet-bag containing the wardrobes of his master and himself. Then, still troubled in mind, he carefully shut the door of his room and descended to Mr. Fogg. Mr. Fogg was quite ready. Under his arm might have been observed a red-bound copy of Bradshaw's Continental Railway, Steam Transit and General Guide, with its timetable showing the arrival and departure of steamers and railways. He took the carpet-bag, opened it, and slipped into it a goodly roll of Bank of England notes, which would pass wherever he might go. "You have forgotten nothing?" asked he. "Nothing, monsieur." "My mackintosh and cloak?" "Here they are." "Good. Take this carpet-bag," handing it to Passepartout. "Take good care of it, for there are £20,000 in it." Passepartout nearly dropped the bag, as if £20,000 were in gold and weighed him down. Master and man then descended. The street door was double-locked, and at the end of Savile Row they took a cab and drove rapidly to Charing Cross. The cab stopped before the railway station at 20 minutes past 8. Passepartout jumped off the box and followed his master, who, after paying the cabman, was about to enter the station. But a poor beggar woman with a child in her arms, her naked feet smeared with mud, her head covered with a wretched bonnet, from which hung a tattered feather, and her shoulders shrouded in a ragged shawl, approached and mournfully asked for alms. Mr. Fogg took out the 20 guineas he had just won at whist, and handed them to the beggar, saying, "Here, my good woman, I'm glad that I met you," and passed on. Passepartout had a moist sensation about the eyes. His master's action touched his susceptible heart. 2 first-class tickets for Paris having been speedily purchased, Mr. Fogg was crossing the station to the train, when he perceived his 5 friends of the Reform. "Well, gentlemen," said he, "I'm off, you see, and if you will examine my passport when I get back, you will be able to judge whether I have accomplished the journey agreed upon." "Oh, that would be quite unnecessary, Mr. Fogg," said Ralph politely. "We will trust your word as a gentleman of honour." "You don't forget when you're due in London again?" asked Stewart. "In 80 days, on Saturday, the 21st of December, 1872, at 9:15 p.m. Goodbye, gentlemen." Phileas Fogg and his servants seated themselves in a first-class carriage at 20 minutes before 9. 5 minutes later, the whistle screamed and the train slowly glided out of that station. The night was dark. A fine, steady rain was falling. Phileas Fogg, snugly ensconced in his corner, did not open his lips. Passepartout, not yet recovered from his stupefaction, clung mechanically to the carpet-bag with its enormous treasure. Just as the train was whirring through Sydenham, Passepartout suddenly uttered a cry of despair. "What's the matter?" asked Mr. Fogg. "Alas, in my hurry, I forgot—" "What?" "To turn the gas off in my room." "Very well, young man," returned Mr. Fogg coolly. "It will burn, at your expense." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5, in which a new species of funds unknown to the moneyed men appears on 'Change. Phileas Fogg rightly suspected that his departure from London would create a lively sensation at the West End. The news of the bet spread through the Reform Club and afforded an exciting topic of conversation to its members.
From the club, it soon got to the papers throughout England. The boasted tour of the world was talked about, disputed, argued with as much warmth as if the subject were another Alabama claim. Some took sides with Phileas Fogg, but the large majority shook their heads and declared against him. It was absurd, impossible, they declared, that the tour of the world could be made, except theoretically and on paper, in this minimum of time. And with the existing means of traveling, the Times, Standard, Morning Post, and Daily News, and 20 other highly respectable newspapers scouted Mr. Fogg's project as madness. The Daily Telegraph alone hesitatingly supported him. People in general thought him a lunatic and blamed his Reform Club friends for having accepted a wager which betrayed the mental aberration of its proposer. Articles no less passionate than logical appeared on the question, for geography is one of the pet subjects of the English, and the columns devoted to Phileas Fogg's venture were eagerly devoured by all classes of readers. At first, some rash individuals, principally of the gentler sex, espoused his cause, which became still more popular when the Illustrated London News came out with his portrait, copied from a photograph in the Reform Club. A few readers of the Daily Telegraph even dared to say, "Why not? After all, stranger things have come to pass." At last, a long article appeared on the 7th of October in the Bulletin of the Royal Geographic Society, who treated the question from every point of view and demonstrated the utter folly of the enterprise. Everything, it said, was against the travellers, every obstacle imposed alike by man and by nature. A miraculous agreement of the times of the departure and arrival, which was impossible, was absolutely necessary to his success. He might, perhaps, reckon on the arrival of trains at the designated hours in Europe, where the distances were relatively moderate. But when he calculated upon crossing India in 3 days, and the United States in 7, could he rely beyond the misgiving upon accomplishing his task? There were accidents to machinery, the liability of trains to run off the line, collisions, bad weather, the blocking up by snow. Were not all these against Phileas Fogg? Would not he find himself, when travelling by steamer in winter, at the mercy of the winds and fogs? Is it uncommon for the best ocean steamers to be 2 or 3 days behind time? But a single delay would suffice to fatally break the chain of communication. Should Phileas Fogg once miss, even by an hour, a steamer, he would have to wait for the next, and that would irrevocably render his attempt vain. This article made a great deal of noise, and, being copied into all the papers, seriously depressed the advocates of the rash tourist. Everybody knows that England is the world of betting men, who are of a higher class than mere gamblers. To bet is in the English temperament. Not only the members of the Reform, but the general public made heavy wagers for or against Phileas Fogg, who was set down in the betting books as if he were a racehorse. Bonds were issued and made their appearance on 'Change. Phileas Fogg bonds were offered at par or at a premium, and a great business was done in them. But 5 days after the article in the Bulletin of the Geographical Society appeared, the demand began to subside. Phileas Fogg declined. They were offered by packages at first of 5, then of 10, until at last nobody would take less than 20, 50, 100. Lord Albemarle, an elderly paralytic gentleman, was now the only advocate of Phileas Fogg left. This noble lord, who was fastened to his chair, would have given his fortune to be able to make the tour of the world, if it took 10 years. He bet £5,000 on Phileas Fogg. When the folly as well as the uselessness of adventure was pointed out to him, he consented himself with replying, "The thing is feasible. The thirst to do it ought to be an Englishman." The Fogg party dwindled more and more. Everybody was going against him, and the bets stood 150, 200 to 1. And a week after his departure, an incident occurred which deprived him of backers at any price. The Commissioner of Police was sitting in his office at 9 o'clock one evening when the following telegraph dispatch was put into his hands. Suez to London. Rowan, Commissioner of Police, Scotland Yard. I found the bank robber, Phileas Fogg. Send without delay warrant of arrest to Bombay. Fix, Detective. The effect of this dispatch was instantaneous. The polished gentleman disappeared to give place to the bank robber. His photograph, which was hung with those rest of the members of the Reform Club, was minutely examined, and it betrayed, feature by feature, the description of the robber which had been provided to the police. The mysterious habits of Phileas Fogg were recalled, his solitary ways, his sudden departure, and it seemed clear that in undertaking a tour around the world on the pretext of a wager, he had no other end in view than to elude the detectives and throw them off his track. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6, in which Fix the Detective betrays a very natural impatience. The circumstances under which this telegraphic dispatch about Phileas Fogg were sent as follows. The steamer Mongolia, belonging to the Peninsular and the Oriental Company, built of iron of 2,800 tons burden and 500 horsepower, was due at 11 o'clock a.m. on Wednesday, the 9th of October, at Suez. The Mongolia plied regularly between Brindisi and Bombay via the Suez Canal, and it was one of the fastest steamers belonging to the company, always making more than 10 knots an hour between Brindisi and Suez, at 9.5 between Suez and Bombay. Two men were promenading up and down the wharves among the crowd of natives and strangers who were sojourning at this once straggling village. Now, thanks to the enterprise of M. Lesseps, a fast-growing town was one of the British consuls at Suez, who, despite the prophecies of the English government and the unfavorable predictions of Stevenson, was in the habit of seeing from his office window English ships daily passing to and fro on the Great Canal, by which the old roundabout route from India to England by the Cape of Good Hope was abridged by at least a half. The other was a small, slight-built personage with a nervous, intelligent face and bright eyes peering out from under eyebrows, which he was incessantly twitching. He was just now manifesting unmistakable signs of impatience, nervously pacing up and down and unable to stand still for a moment. This was Fix, one of the detectives who had been dispatched from England in search of the bank robber. It was his task to narrowly watch every passenger who arrived at Suez and to follow up all who seemed to be suspicious characters or bore a resemblance to the description of the criminal, which he had received 2 days before from the police headquarters at London. The detective was evidently inspired by the hope of obtaining the splendid reward, which could easily be the prize of success, and awaited with a feverish impatience, easy to understand, the arrival of the steamer Mongolia. "So you say, Consul," he asked for the 20th time, "that this steamer is never behind time?" "No, Mr. Fix," replied the consul. "She was bespoken yesterday at Port Said, and the rest of the way is no account to such a craft. I repeat, the Mongolia has been in advance of the time required by the company's regulation and gained the prize awarded for excessive speed. Does she come directly from Brindisi?" "Directly from Brindisi. She takes on the Indian mails there, and she left there Saturday at 5 p.m. Have patience, Mr. Fix. She will not be late, but really I don't see how. From the description you have, you will be able to recognize your man, even if he's on board the Mongolia. A man rather feels the presence of these fellows, Consul, that recognizes them. You must have the scent for them. A scent is like a sixth sense, which combines hearing, seeing, smelling. I've arrested more than one of these gentlemen in my time, and if my thief is on board, I'll answer for it. He'll not slip through my fingers." "I hope so, Mr. Fix, for it was a heavy robbery." "A magnificent robbery, Consul. £55,000. We don't often have such windfalls. Burglars are getting to be so contemptible nowadays. A fellow gets hung for a handful of shillings." "Mr. Fix," said the consul, "I like your way of talking, and I hope you'll succeed, but I fear you'll have to find it far from easy. Don't you see the description of which you have as a singular resemblance to an honest man?" "Consul," remarked the detective dogmatically, "great robbers always resemble honest folks. Fellows who have rascally faces have only one course to take, and that is to remain honest. Otherwise they would be arrested offhand. It's the artistic thing is to unmask honest countenances. It's no light task, I admit, but it's real art." Mr. Fix evidently was not wanting in a tinge of self-conceit. Little by little the scene on the quay became more animated. Sailors of various nations, merchants, shipbrokers, porters, fellahs bustled to and fro, as if the steamer were immediately expected. The weather was clear and slightly chilly. The minarets of the town loomed above the houses in the pale rays of the sun. A jetty pier, some 2,000 yards long, extended to the roadstead. A number of fishing smacks and coasting boats, some retaining the fantastic fashion of the ancient galleys, were discernible on the Red Sea. As he passed among the busy crowd, Fix, according to habit, scrutinized the passers-by with a keen, rapid glance. It was now 10:30. "The same it didn't come," he exclaimed as the port clock struck. "She can't be far off now," returned his companion. "How long will she stop at Suez?" 4 hours. Long enough to get in coal. It's 1,310 miles from Suez to Aden, and the other end of the Red Sea she has to take a fresh coal supply." "And does she go from Suez directly to Bombay?" "Without putting in anywhere." "Good," said Fix. "If the robber's on foot, he will no doubt get off at Suez, so as to reach the Dutch or French colonies in Asia by some other route. He ought to know that he would not be safe an hour in India, which is English soil." "Unless," objected the consul, "he is exceptionally shrewd. An English criminal, you know, is always better concealed in London than in anywhere else." This observation furnished the detective food for thought, and meanwhile the consul went away to his office. Fix, left alone, was more impatient than ever, having a presentiment that the robber was on board the Mongolia. If he had indeed left London intending to reach the New World, he would naturally take the route via India, which was less watched and more difficult to watch than that of the Atlantic. But Fix's reflections were soon interrupted by a succession of sharp whistles, which announced the arrival of the Mongolia. The porters and fellows rushed down to the quay, and a dozen boats pushed off from the shore to go and meet the steamer. Soon her gigantic hull appeared passing along between the banks, and 11 o'clock struck as she anchored in the road. She brought an unusual number of passengers, some of whom remained on deck to scan the picturesque panorama of the town, while the greater part disembarked in boats and landed on the quay. Fix took up a position and carefully examined each face and figure which made its appearance. Presently, one of the passengers, after vigorously pushing his way through the importunate crowd of porters, came up to him and politely asked if he could point out the English consulate, at the same time showing a passport which he wished to have visaed. Fix instinctively took the passport, and with a rapid glance read the description of its bearer. An involuntary motion of surprise nearly escaped him, for the description in the passport was identical with that of the bank robber which he had received from Scotland Yard. "Is this your passport?" asked he. "No, it's my master's, and your master is dead on board. But he must go to the consuls in person so as to establish his identity." "Oh, is that necessary?" "Quite indispensable." "And where is the consulate?" "There, on the corner of the square," said Fix, pointing to a house 200 steps off. "I'll go and fetch my master, who won't be much pleased, however, to be disturbed." The passenger bowed to Fix and returned to the steamer. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7, which once more demonstrates the uselessness of passports as aids to detectives. The detective passed down the quay and rapidly made his way to the consul's office, where he was at once admitted to the presence of that official. "Counsel," he said without preamble, "I've strong reasons for believing that my man is a passenger on the Mongolia," and he narrated what had just passed concerning the passport. "Well, Mr. Fix," replied the counsel, "I should not be sorry to see the rascal's face, but perhaps he won't come here. That is, if he's the person you suppose him to be. A robber doesn't quite like to leave traces of his flight behind him, and besides, he's not obliged to have his passport countersigned. If he's as shrewd as I think he is, counsel, he will come. To have his passport visaed? Yes, passports are only good for annoying honest folks, and aiding in the flight of rogues. I assure you it would be quite the thing for him to do, but I hope you would not visa the passport." "Why not? If the passport's genuine, I have no right to refuse. Still, I must keep this man here until I can get a warrant to arrest him from London." "Ah, that's your lookout, but I cannot—" The counsel did not finish his sentence, for as he spoke, a knock was heard at the door. Two strangers entered, one of whom was the servant who Fix had met on the quay. The other, who was his master, held out his passport with a request that the counsel could do him the favour to visa it. The consul took the document and carefully read it, whilst Fix observed, or rather devoured, the stranger with his eyes from the corner of a room. "You're Mr. Phileas Fogg," said the consul, after reading the passport. "I am. And this man is your servant?" "He's a Frenchman named Passepartout." "You're from London?" "Yes." "And you are going to Bombay?" "Very good, sir. You know that a visa is useless and that no passport is required." "I know it, sir," replied Phileas Fogg, "but I wish to prove by your visa that I came by Suez." "Very well, sir." The consul proceeded to sign and date the passport, after which he added his official seal. Mr. Fogg paid the customary fee, coldly bowed, and went out followed by his servant. "Well?" queried the detective. "Well, he looks and acts like a perfectly honest man," replied the consul. "Possibly, but that is not the question. Do you think, counsel, that this phlegmatic gentleman resembles, feature by feature, the robber whose description I have received?" "I concede that, but then you know all descriptions—" "I'll make certain of it," interrupted Fix. "The servant seems to me less mysterious than the master. Besides, he's a Frenchman, and can't help talking. Excuse me for a little while, consul." Fix started off in search of Passepartout. Meanwhile, Mr. Fogg, after leaving the consulate, repaired to the quay, gave some orders to Passepartout, went off to the Mongolia in a boat, and descended to his cabin. He took up his notebook, which contained the following memoranda. Left London Wednesday, October 2nd at 8:45 p.m. Reached Paris Thursday, October 3rd at 7:20 a.m. Left Paris Thursday at 8:40 a.m. Reached Turin by Monsignus Friday, October 4th at 6:35 a.m. Left Turin Friday at 7:20 a.m. Arrived at Brindisi Saturday, October 5th at 4 p.m. Sailed on the Mongolia Saturday at 5 p.m. Reached Suez Wednesday, October 9th at 11 a.m. Total hours spent 158, or in days, 6 days and a half. These dates were inscribed in an itinerary divided into columns, indicating the month, the day of the month, and the day of the stipulated and actual arrivals at each principal point: Paris, Brindisi, Suez, Bombay, Calcutta, Singapore, Hong Kong, Yokohama, San Francisco, New York, and London from the 2nd of October to the 21st of December, and giving a space for setting down the gain made or the loss suffered on the arrival at each locality. This methodical record thus contained an account of everything needed, and Mr. Fogg always knew whether he was behindhand or in advance in his time. On this Friday, October 9th, he noted his arrival at Suez, and observed that he had as yet neither gained nor lost. He sat down quietly to breakfast in his hand, and never once thinking of inspecting the town, being one of those Englishmen who are wont to see foreign countries through the eyes of their domestics. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8, in which Passepartout talks rather more perhaps than is prudent. Fix soon rejoined Passepartout, who was lounging and looking about on the quay, as if he did not feel that he, at least, was obliged to not see anything. "Well, my friend," said the detective, coming up with him, "is your passport valid?" "So it is, monsieur," responded Passepartout. "Thanks, yes, the passport is all right." "Are you looking about you?" "Yes, we travel so fast that I seem to be journeying into a dream. So this is Suez?" "Yes." "In Egypt?" "Certainly, in Egypt." "And in Africa?" "In Africa." "In Africa," repeated Passepartout. "Just think, monsieur, I had no idea that we should go farther than Paris, and all I saw of Paris was between 20 minutes past 7 and 20 minutes before 9 in the morning, between the northern and the line stations, through the windows of a car and in the driving rain. How I regret not seeing once more Père Lachaise and the Circus of Champs-Élysées." "You're in a great hurry, then?" "I am not, but my master is. By the way, I must buy some shoes and shirts. We came away without trunks and only with a carpet bag. I will show you an excellent shop for getting what you want." "Really, master, you're so kind." And they walked off together, Passepartout chatting volubly as they went along. "Above all," said he, "don't let me lose the steamer. You've got plenty of time. It's only 12 o'clock. Passepartout pulled out his big watch. 12, he examined. "Why, it's only 8 minutes before 10. "Your watch is slow." "My watch? A family watch, monsieur, which has come down from my great-grandfather. It does not vary 5 minutes in the year. It's a perfect chronometer. Look, you." "I'll say how it is," said Fix. "You've kept London time, which is 2 hours behind that of Suez. You ought to regulate your watch at noon in each country." "I regulate my watch." "Never." "Well, then, it will not agree with his sun." "So much the worse for the sun, monsieur. The sun will be wrong, then." And the worthy fellow returned the watch to its fob with a defiant gesture. After a few minutes' silence, Fix resumed. "You left London hastily, then?" "I'd rather think so. Last Friday at 8 o'clock in the evening, Monsieur Fogg came home from his club, and 3/4 of an hour afterwards we were off." "But where's your master going?" "Always straight ahead. He's going around the world." "Round the world?" cried Fix. "Yes, in 80 days. He says it's on a wager, but between us, I don't believe a word of it. That wouldn't be a common sense. There's something else in the wind." "Ah, Mr. Fogg is a character, is he?" "I should say he was." "Is he rich?" "No doubt, for he's carrying an enormous sum in brand-new banknotes with him. And he didn't spare the money on the way either. He has offered a large reward to the engineer of the Mongolia if he gets us to Bombay well in advance of time." "And you've known your master a long time?" "What, no? I entered his service the very day we left London." The effect of these replies upon the already suspicious and excited detective may be imagined. The hasty departure from London soon after the robbery, the large sum carried by Mr. Fogg, his eagerness to reach distant countries, the pretext of an eccentric and foolhardy bet, all confirmed Fix of his theory. He continued to pump poor Passepartout, and learned that he really knew little or nothing of his master, who lived a solitary existence in London, was said to be rich, though no one knew whence came his riches, and was mysterious and impenetrable in his fares and habits. Fix felt sure that Phileas Fogg would not land at Suez, but was really going on to Bombay. "Is Bombay far from here?" asked Passepartout. "Pretty far. It's a 10 days' voyage by sea." "And what country is Bombay?" "India." "In Asia?" "Certainly." "The deuce! I was going to tell you there's one thing that worries me. My burner." "What burner?" "My gas burner, which I forgot to turn off, which is at this moment burning at my expense. I've calculated, monsieur, that I shall lose 2 shillings every 24 hours, exactly 6 pence more than I earn, and you will understand the longer our journey." Did Fix pay any attention to Passepartout's trouble about the gas? It is not probable. He was not listening, but cogitating a project. Passepartout and he had now reached the shop where Fix left his companion to make purchases, After recommending him not to miss the steamer, and hurried back to the consulate, now that he was fully convinced, Fix had quite recovered his equanimity. "Gangster," said he, "I no longer have any doubt. I've spotted my man. He passes himself as an old stick who's going around the world in 80 days. He is a sharp fellow," returned the consul, "and counts on returning to London after putting the police of 2 countries off his track." "We'll see about that," replied Fix. "But you're not mistaken." "I'm not mistaken." "Why was this robber so anxious to prove by the visa that he had passed through Suez?" "What? I've no idea, but listen to me." He reported in a few words the most important parts of his conversation with Passepartout. "In short," said the consul, "appearances are wholly against this man. And what are you going to do?" "Send a dispatch to London for a warrant of arrest to be dispatched instantly to Bombay, and take passage aboard the Mongolia. Follow my road to India, and there, on English ground, arrest him politely, with my warrant in my hand and my hand on his shoulder." Having uttered these words with a cool, careless air, the detective took leave of the consul, and repaired to the telegraph office, whence he sent the dispatch which we have seen in the London police office. A quarter of an hour later, found Fix, with a small bag in his hand, proceeding on board the Mongolia, and ere many moments longer, the noble steamer rode out at full steam upon the waters of the Red Sea. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9, in which the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean proved propitious to the designs of Phileas Fogg. The distance between the Suez and the Aden is precisely 1,310 miles, and the regulations of the company allow steamers 138 hours in which to traverse it. The Mongolia, thanks to the vigorous exertions of the engineer, seemed likely, so rapid was her speed, to rather reach her destination considerably within that time. The greater part of the passengers from Brindisi were bound for India, some for Bombay, others for Calcutta by way of Bombay, the nearest route thither. Now that a railway crosses the Indian peninsula, among the passengers was a number of officials and military officers of various grades, the latter being either attached to the regular British forces or commanding the sepoy troops, and receiving high salaries ever since the central government has assumed the powers of the East India Company, for the sub-lieutenants get £280, brigadiers £2,400, and generals of divisions £4,000. With what the military men, a number of rich young Englishmen on their travels, and the hospitable efforts of the purser, the time passed quickly on the Mongolia. The best of fare was spread upon the cabin tables at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the 8 o'clock supper, and the ladies scrupulously changed their toilets twice a day, and the hours were whirled away when the sea was tranquil with the music, dancing, and games. But the Red Sea is full of caprice, and often boisterous. Like most long, narrow gulfs, when the wind came from the Africa or Asian coast, the Mongolia, with her long hull, rolled fearfully. Then the ladies speedily disappeared below, the pianos were silent, singing and dancing suddenly ceased, yet the good ship ploughed straight on, unretarded by wind or wave towards the straits of Bab el Mandeb. What was Phileas Fogg doing all this time? It might be through that in his anxiety he would be constantly watching the changes of the wind and the disorderly raging of the billows, every chance, in short, which might force the Mongolia to slacken her speed, and thus interrupt his journey. But if he thought of these possibilities, he did not betray the fact by any outward sign. Always the same impassible member of the Reform Club, whom no incident could surprise, as unwavering as the ship's chronometers, and seldom having the curiosity to even go upon the deck. He passed through the memorable scenes of the Red Sea with cold indifference, did not care to recognize the historic towns and villages such along its borders, raised their picturesque outlines against the sky, and betrayed no fear of the dangers of the Arabic Gulf, which the old historians always spoke of with horror, and upon which the ancient navigators never ventured without propitiating the gods by ample sacrifices. How did this eccentric personage pass his time on the Mongolia? He made his 4 hearty meals a day, regardless of the most persistent rolling and pitching on the part of the steamer, and he played whist indefatigably, for he had found partners as enthusiastic in the game as himself, a tax collector on the way to his post at Goa, the Reverend Decimus Smith returning to his parish at Bombay, and a brigadier general of the English army, who was about to rejoin his brigade at Benares, made up the party, and with Mr. Fogg played whist by the hour together in absorbing silence. As for Passepartout, he too had escaped seasickness, and took his meals conscientiously in the forward cabin. He rather enjoyed the voyage, for he was well fed and well lodged, took a great interest in the scenes through which they were passing, and consoled himself with the delusion that his master's whim would end at Bombay. He was pleased on the day after leaving Suez to find on deck the obliging person with whom he had walked and chatted on the quays. "If I am not mistaken," said he, approaching this person with his most amiable smile, "you are the gentleman who so kindly volunteered to guide me at Suez." "Ah, I quite recognize you. You're that servant of that strange Englishman, Je suis Monsieur Fix." "Monsieur Fix," resumed Passepartout, "I am charmed to find you on board. Where are you bound?" "L'Anquille de Bombay." "That's capital. Have you made this trip before?" "Several times. I'm one of the guests of the Peninsular Company." "Then you know India?" "Why, yes," replied Fix, who spoke cautiously. "A curious place, this India?" "Oh, very curious. Mosques, minarets, temples, fakirs, pagodas, tigers, snakes, elephants. I hope you will have ample time to see the sights." "I hope so, Monsieur Fix. You see, a man of sound sense ought not to spend his life jumping from a steamer upon a railway train, and from a railway train upon the steamer again, pretending to make the tour of the world in 80 days. No, all these gymnastics, you may well be sure, will cease at Bombay." "And Mr. Fogg is getting along well?" asked Fix, in the most natural tone in the world. "Quite well, and I too. I eat like a famished ogre. It's the sea air. But I've never seen your master on deck. Never. He hasn't the least curiosity." "Did you know, Mr. Passepartout, that this pretended tour in 80 days may conceal some secret errand, perhaps a diplomatic mission?" "Faith, Monsieur Fix, I assure you, I know nothing about it. Nor would I give half a crown to find out." After this meeting, Passepartout and Fix got into the habit of chatting together, the latter making it a point to gain the worthy man's confidence. He frequently offered him a glass of whiskey or pale ale in the steamer's bar-room, which Passepartout never failed to accept with grateful alacrity, mentally pronouncing Fix the best of good fellows. Meanwhile, the Mongolia was pushing forward rapidly. On the 13th, Mocha, surrounded by its ruined walls, whereon date trees were growing, was sighted. And on the mountains beyond were the Espida and vast coffee fields. Passepartout was ravished to behold this celebrated place, and thought that, with its circular walls and dismantled fort, it looked like an immense coffee cup and saucer. The following night they passed through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, which means in Arabic, the Bridge of Tears, and the next day they put in at Steamer Point, northwest of Aden Harbour, to take in coal. This matter of feuding steamers is a serious one at such distances from the coal mines. It cost the Peninsular Company some £800,000 a year in these distant seas. Coal is worth £3 or £4 sterling a ton. The Mongolia had still 1,655 miles to traverse before reaching Bombay, and was obliged to remain 4 hours at Steamer Point to coal up. But this delay, as it was foreseen, did not affect Phileas Fogg's program. Besides, the Mongolia, instead of reaching Aden on the morning of the 15th when she was due, arrived there on the evening of the 14th, a gain of 15 hours. Mr. Fogg and his servant went ashore at Aden to have the passport again visaed. Fix, unobserved, followed them. The visa procured, Mr. Fogg returned on board to resume his former habits, while Passepartout, according to custom, sauntered about among the mixed population of Somalis, Bayans, Parsis, Jews, Arabs, and Europeans, who comprised the 25,000 inhabitants of Aden. He gazed with wonder upon the fortifications that make this place the Gibraltar of the Indian Ocean, and 2 vast cisterns where the English engineers were still at work 2,000 years after the engineers of Solomon. Very curious, said Passepartout to himself, on returning to the steamer. I see that it is by no means useless to travel, if a man wants to see something new. At 6 p.m., the Mongolia slowly moved out of the roadstead, and was soon once more on the Indian Ocean. She had 168 hours in which to reach Bombay, and the sea was favorable, the wind being in the northwest and all sails aiding the engine. The steamer rolled a little, but the ladies in fresh toilets reappeared on the deck, and the most singing and dancing was resumed. The trip was being accomplished most successfully, and Passepartout was enchanted with the congenial companion which chance had secured him in the person of the delightful Fix. On Sunday, October 20th, towards noon, they came in sight of the Indian coast. 2 hours later the pilot came on board. A range of hills lay against the sky and the horizon, and soon the rows of palms which adorned Bombay came distinctly into view. The steamer entered the road formed by the islands and the bay, and 4:30 she hauled up the quays of Bombay. Phileas Fogg was in the act of finishing the 33rd rubber of the voyage, and his partner and himself having by bold stroke captured all 13 of the tricks. This concluded his fine campaign with a brilliant victory. The Mongolia was due at Bombay on the 22nd. She arrived on the 20th, This was a gain to Phileas Fogg of 2 days since his departure from London, and he calmly entered that fact in the itinerary in the column of gains. End of Chapter 9.